everyone, I'm Mims and welcome to the channel. Thanks for being here. There are a lot of reasons why we pick a tarot deck. The art appeals to us. Maybe we want to learn a new system. Maybe you want to pick up Thoth, or maybe you want to go back to the classic, work with Tarot de Marseille and Italian decks. Maybe you want to, maybe the art appeals to you and so you pick that deck up. Or everybody's been talking about a particular deck and you just feel like, okay, I'm finally ready to try that one out. Or maybe there's a deck that's made that shows your sense of place. I have bought decks for all of those reasons and used them for all of those reasons. But today I thought that I would talk about, for lack of a better phrase, I'm calling it Tarot Plus. And I listened to myself watching a video or listening to a video of mine. I was making sure before I posted it. And there was, in one of them, I talked about how sometimes a deck can be your entry point into something. And then other times it might reflect an interest of yours. Anyway, for anybody who has more than one deck, what was the reason for the second deck and then beyond? Particularly if you have what, I would say over 5 is probably considered a collection. And everybody has a different number for that. But anyway, I was thinking about it. And I realized that my interest in tarot at the beginning was very much about learning the system and learning the history and learning symbolism and learning how to read. And it was very much for me a self-development tool, as well as a way of reflection, which I guess can be considered self-development, and also as a point in my spirituality. And there's also, I think, something to me magical about tarot, and at least in the way that I practice, there's something about bringing in the magic in whatever way, shape, or form. I'm not even talking necessarily spells, but something about making the day special because of ritual, if that makes sense. So those are some of the many reasons of why I use tarot or practice with tarot. I'm not even sure the right way to describe all of that. But I wanted today to really talk about that other aspect of tarot, which is that, again, what I'm going to call Tarot Plus. And it could be that you have a particular interest or a passion or a hobby or something, we'll just call it that, we'll just call it an interest, and then you find a tarot deck that also reflects that. And then you're able to possibly add dimension to your tarot practice and add dimension to this other interest of yours. Whether they apparently would overlap or not, we are now in an age of where there are so many different tarot decks, some very specific, some very broad. But I realized that one of the things, like looking back at my tarot collection, and I often say tarot, and I also might also include oracle and so forth. In this case, I do have one oracle deck. But I just thought that I would share some of the decks that I have and why I was interested in them in particular, because I do feel like they did unite another interest of mine. And I'm going to start with, this is an out-of-print one. This is, I think, the only out-of-print one. So I will list all of the decks in the show notes in the order that I've shown them. And then this one will be out of print, so sorry for that. But the Art History Tarot for Past Lives. This tarot, and there's a lot of tarot decks that I think do this. This one is specifically, this is published by Red Orchid. And this deck is designed, just like what its name implies, for past lives. So you can do like some past life readings and so forth. But I will tell you that my interest in this deck lied in its beauty and what it does. So there are quite a few art curated decks. You know, Lo Scarabeo has quite a few that are based on or in the style of a particular artist. They have a surreal one, and so forth. But one of the things that I like about this, and decks similar, is that there are, I have it in order, I don't know why, it doesn't really matter. But this one, even if you didn't want to use it for the past lives aspect, and I'm still learning about that, but one of the things that I only learned about this deck after it went out of print. But one of the things that I love about this one is that it gives you the artist and the name of the painting. And then the booklet gives you the same thing. I think you have to buy the book separately. I was able to get mine used, including both. But this includes a little something about the art. So, I like this deck. Its entry point for me was the art history aspect. I never took an art history class in college. I took jazz because I love jazz in my bones and I wanted to know more about it. I wanted to know why John Coltrane lights me on fire, in a good way. Anyway, so this deck, and like I said, there are many others, but one of the things that I loved about this one is that it did have the art and the artist right on the front of the cards. And I thought that that was a neat way for me to study a little bit of art history. And, you know, to learn even just a tiny bit more, to learn a little bit about those particular artists and so forth. And I want this to be kind of a jumping off point. So I'm going to use this deck not just for the study of art history, because there's probably a lot of other ways I could have done that, right? But I loved that this ended up being a lovely way to do that. And, you know, that if I did want to even somehow like quiz myself on what it was, you know, I could just cover that up and still be able to figure them out. So this is a great example of that, where it has another dimension to it. In this case, the study of art history, or at least an intro in some ways. So yeah, so the art history for past lives is my entry point into a bit of art history study. Now, this deck, and they even say it at the beginning, they talk about that, let's see. I even like how they say, I feel a need to acknowledge that this deck is not as inclusive as it would ideally believe. Much of art history is Eurocentric. Efforts were made to find artists and subject matter from diverse cultures, but as I was limited to royalty-free public domain images for the project, the deck does not include the range of history I would deem ideal. So again, this is only my entry point, not only into this kind of work in terms of tarot, but also in terms of like art history. I feel like this would just be the beginning. And it's something that I've long wanted to study, and I'm kind of finally at that, like, quit talking about the things you want to do and start doing the things you want to do, even if you do them in a slightly different way. And one of the things as an adult, working and possibly going back to school for something else, it's nice to have something that I can do a little self-study, and this might prompt me to get like off the computer and looking at images and things. And you know, there's a bazillion decks out there. This happens to be the one that I have that would help me with that. But I think that it's a great way, or it can be a lovely way to unite tarot in one of your passions or interests. Okay, another one. Reading and literature. So this is a great example, and I actually have the book. I didn't grab it. But this is the Literary Witches Oracle. This is by Taisia Kitaiskaia and Katy Koran. This came out in 2019, but the book originally came out in 2017, so it was a book first. Now, I don't know if in their proposal they decided, like, hey, we want to make a book and we also want to make a deck. I'm not sure about that, but this one is quite cool. It has 70 cards, including 50 artists, if I have the numbers right. Let me just double check. And I know this is a deck. Oh, there's 30 authors. Okay, not as many as I was thinking, but still. So you can really divide this deck into two parts. So these are the tools, or the witches. Yeah, I think they're called the witches' tools. And then these are the artists. So I'm going to show the author. I'm going to show the author pictures. So this, I think, is a lovely way into studying literature or broadening my reading horizons. I have used this at times for like picking a card and then going to the library and seeing what they had, and then trying to find out more about the the biography. So they're all female or female identifying authors. And then some it was like, I haven't read Anais Nin since college. And I didn't read her for a class. It was because of a friend of mine loved her. And so then I was reading. But sometimes it's just nice to have, like, okay, what do I know? And the booklet definitely has, or the book, which is this, which you buy separately, includes more detail. But I do feel like even this little guidebook, like if you only had the deck, or if you were trying to decide between the two and you really would like the cards, this does give you an entry point that gives you their kind of an overall theme for their work, and then a little a short biographical note. But again, I feel like this is a great example of tarot as a jumping off point. Studying or broadening your reading. And I love this one because it does include some authors I didn't know about, and not all just a bunch of white ladies. So anyway, the Literary Oracle, or the Literary Witches Oracle, as a great kind of jumping off point. Similar, and in fact they're both published by Clarkson Potter, Tarot of the Divine. I've talked about this deck, it's one of my favorites. This is, and I know a lot of people know it, Yoshitani. This is, I think, and I know that there are quite a few, these are, again, I'm just showing the examples of decks that I happen to have in my collection that do this, and I think do it quite well. But there are a ton of other decks out there that do the same. And so if you are maybe considering some of this yourself, think about like what's in your collection that might do that very thing. And this one I think is great. So this deck is all based on folk tales and fairy tales and deities. I think that's even what it says. Yeah, inspired by deities, folklore, and fairy tales. So the critique, I think, of this one has been that it only gives you the story and it doesn't always explain it very well in this tiny little booklet. But I would argue that it's a good jumping off point. And you can also buy separately, similar to the way the Literary Witches is. I'm sure there's some marketing there. But it does give you the name of the folktale or the deity and where it's from. And if you have access, I'm not saying doing an internet search is the same as like really getting to know that story, but it can be a jumping off point. And I would argue that this definitely has helped me to do that. Even before I had the booklet, and I had this deck actually for a couple of years before I even realized that there was a book that could go along with it or not. And they've designed the book that it can be just on its own. In fact, it doesn't even reference the cards. So you would have to, you kind of have to do a little bit of cross-referencing. But this is another example of another type of reading and or literature, right? And to call it literature, I don't mean to, whatever you want to call it, stories. Whether you just want to know folktales from around the world. This, I feel like, is a lovely one, and I definitely would like to dive in a bit deeper with this, you know, and really read through the folk tales and look at the card and look at it and really kind of do more of a, not so much of a tarot deck study, but more of a deck study from the standpoint of all of the cards and those stories. So this, again, I feel like the deck gives you, it's the jumping off point. And whether you're coming to it from the tarot deck and then jumping off, or you're coming to it from the interest of and then get the tarot deck, I think either way, it's just a different path, right? So that's Tarot of the Divine by Yoshitani. Okay. Similar, and that's why I kind of had these in piles. I'm a big Jane Austen fan. I've talked about that before. And one of the things that I love is when there's a tarot deck that reflects some of my interest. So I don't necessarily think that a tarot deck is going to get me to better understand the story, but it can give you a different dimension. And there are several Jane Austen tarot decks out there. And there's even some playing cards that give you, I have a couple of tarot decks, or playing card decks, that include like quotes from some of the books and some of the characters. Anyway, this one has all of the majors and all of the court cards are characters from the book. Oops. And then the pips are really just non-scenic pips. But let's just, and like the world happens to be Jane Austen in this case. Yeah. Speaking of, there's the world. And so this one is fun, I think. And I've talked about this before, and I know I'm not unique in this. People have done this for a long time. A great way to practice if you're new to tarot is to use tarot and like read for characters. Like if you don't have someone to read for besides yourself, or you're not quite ready to maybe read for your friends and family members, read for book characters, read for people in a show or people in a movie, even if it's one you've seen. You could use that, like, you know, there might be a decision point by the character, and you might read, like, what's the energy? What would happen if Emma did something different? That's not Emma, but I'm just using that as the example. One of the early books when I was first learning tarot, one of the books that I had, that was the suggestion, was to read for characters. And I loved that because I knew, like Jane Austen, I read every couple of years, and so I knew the stories quite well, and so I could like think about like, okay, what's a turning point in Emma? What's, you know, what would happen if, or what's even like what happens at the end, right? Like, you know, the book ends and then you could go from there. Like what happens to Bingley and Jane in Pride and Prejudice after the book, after they get married, all of that. So in this case, it could be a way to just enjoy reading an author. You know, like in this case, it might be a point of like learning more about new to you or new to me writers. But it can also just maybe add a dimension to something you already love. Like in this case, reading Jane Austen. And then the guidebook has a bit, and you could even use it almost like a point if you're wanting to think about literature and like study and analyze. You know, if you're reading the guidebook and it talks about, like for instance, I don't know, let's just pick justice. I'm not going to get into this, but in this case, justice, they talk about Anne Elliot and persuasion. And so you could read the guidebook and think, like, does that correlate to the way that I understand that story? Or how does that differ from the way that I think about that story? And then this particular one, this one is by Linda Falken. This is published by, oh, I forget who it's published by. This is published by the Bookshop Limited. This one has in the back, and I'm guessing it has the characters and where they're referenced within the deck and then the book. And so, again, I'm not saying that buying a tarot deck will help you to understand Jane Austen better, but if you're wanting a different perspective on Jane Austen or wanting to add some depth to your reading, this is a great example. And it doesn't have to be Jane Austen. It might be some other thing that you love. You know, if you're wanting to get into Shakespeare, you know, there are several Shakespeare decks out there, mass market and independent, or somebody else. It doesn't have to be that. Those are just ones that I'm thinking of off the top of my head. This is a deck that I thought about, and in fact, I was interested specifically because of the subject matter of this tarot deck. This is the American Renaissance Tarot. This is by Thea Wirsching, and it's illustrated by Celeste. Pille? I'm not sure. I really need to work on pronunciation and quit saying that I need to. So this is, I think, quite a unique approach. This came out in, I think it came out in 2021 or 2019. I cannot remember. In my head I have 2021, but all of a sudden I don't know. Let's just take a look at that. Let's see. Okay, 2021. So here you have a chunky guidebook. And this one is interesting because it does approach tarot from a literary standpoint. So the American Renaissance, as I understood it, was kind of 1830 to 1860-ish. And this book says 1825 to 1875, I think. And so this one is kind of talking about this point in American history, or U.S. history, I think is a better way for me to say it, that the abolitionist movement, which is anti-slavery, the women's suffrage movement, the prohibition movement, as well as the transcendentalists and so forth. I'm just going to show you a few of the cards. So I remember this is one of my very favorite periods of history. It's also one of my favorites in terms of like writers. I love Emerson and Thoreau. And so I love this standpoint that this deck takes. I think it's quite unique in the sense of uniting all of these different things into one deck. And I think it's a great one. The author, or the creator of this deck, Thea, I didn't have this deck yet, but the fall of 2024, so it's been more than just the fall, but during the presidential election, she actually was teaching a class, and I remember seeing that at the time thinking, I had too much going on, and I couldn't commit financially to a new deck and a class on top of everything else that was going on. But anyway, the way that this is approached is, how does she put it? So the 19th century world, a world at once so familiar and strange to 21st century eyes. They talk, anyway, it talks about literature, it also talks about the history of racism and slavery and so forth. So this kind of approaches it from like the literary standpoint as well as a historical standpoint and kind of bringing it together. And of course those overlap. But this deck, I think, is quite lovely in its attempt for doing so. And I do think that this feels like a really good jumping off point to go back and reread some of those works, or one, just to read the book. There's quite a bit there. And one of the things that I love that a lot of decks don't do that, and I wish more would, particularly when they're supposed to be like someone famous or someone historical. That the table of contents tells you who everyone is. So if you happen to pick up a card, you don't have to like flip to King of Swords to figure it out. It's right there in the table of contents, which I think is great. So I feel like, again, this is a point of history that I am familiar with, but it definitely feels like one that for me, the tarot deck felt like a way to go in deeper and to kind of hone in on maybe some things that I've missed or things that I haven't read and so forth. So that's the American Renaissance Tarot. Okay, another example is the Swagatam Tarot. Now, I've been thinking about this for a while, and I could have pulled this other deck out and I totally forgot about it, but now not all of us do, but several, including me, I approach tarot from a spirituality standpoint. For me, it is a way to communicate with spirit, universe, God, whatever you want to call it. And again, I'm speaking kind of broadly here, because while I might be talking about my particular tarot decks, you know, I'm sure others think of these things as well. So I started back in the winter of 2024. I got the Biblical Tarot, and then the creator sent me a copy of their second deck, which was like a shadow deck. It's kind of the same deck, but it's a black and white one. I was doing that for a personal religious shadow study. I wanted to be more knowledgeable in what I had been brought up as in childhood, and then why I rejected it. And you know, I never was a religious study major, but I often I've longed, since I was little even, have enjoyed learning about different religions and philosophies and how they impact us culturally and otherwise. I remember asking, like, as a kid, like, okay, why do they think they're special? You know, the church down the road or whatever. What makes them unique? What makes them different? How is it that we practice that's different? And then broadening that. And so I think that, and then of course, you know, tarot has history in, you know, different religions, symbolism, etc., right? Some have been commandeered, like everything. But I found this deck, and it was super on sale, so I didn't even know about it. It popped up because it was on sale. It's the Swagatam Tarot. And this one is, the word Swagatam means welcome in Sanskrit, one of the most ancient languages in the world. This deck is based on Indian culture combined with the philosophy of Hinduism. So I remember thinking, boom, I'm there. So this deck is by Pankuri Agarwal, and this is published by Red Feather. And while this book doesn't look as in-depth, it does give you a bit more about like what's in the, you know, what's in the cards and so forth. And I thought that this was, oh, by the way, it's also just a beautiful deck. And so I loved how this deck, oh, those are the backs, that this deck, even though I didn't know anything about it, I remember deciding like, okay, I'm going to pick that deck up, and then this will be my entry point into learning more about Hinduism and Indian culture. Now, is a deck going to do all of that by itself? No. Would a deck help me perhaps reflect on things that I've read and so forth? Absolutely. And I've actually thought about, you know, how the Biblical Tarot has helped me with my own learning, you know, a little bit more about some biblical knowledge, and even just to better identify you know, stories and things that I remember from childhood but don't remember the context or whatever. This deck to me felt like another way to, like, I could read some work and then have, you know, read some books and then have this deck to help give me another dimension. And I think you could do that, well, you could do that with a lot of things. It wouldn't even have to be with religion. But because I'm interested in religion and philosophy, I think this definitely would be a neat way to study. You know, even just, and when I say study, it doesn't necessarily mean like taking a class, but maybe using the deck to reflect, you know, reading the guidebook, and then, you know, if there are, I don't know if this one includes, you know, footnotes or anything, but I'm sure, yeah. So it doesn't really include, you know, footnotes or things, but it's a good jumping off point into studying more about a particular religion or philosophy. You know, there's several different, like, Buddhism decks out there, you know, or even just points in history. There's the Byzantine deck, tarot deck, you know, if you wanted to study that point in history. I just think that tarot can give us, you know, some ways of doing that. And if you are out of school or didn't like school but enjoy learning on your own, tarot might give you, a tarot deck and some books might give you a little bit of structure to your thing. And at least I think it's helping me. And again, I'm not diving into all of these all together now, but I have used some of these in the past for study, and I'm going to use some of these in the future. Now, these are two examples that I think are similar, but if you're interested in, like, plants or animals, you might get, and I'm just saying the broad sense of plants or animals, you might find, this is the Tarot Botanicals deck. This is a black and white plant deck. And one of the things that I love about this black and white plant deck is we often think about plants and, like, all of their color and so forth. But in this case, you know, we have very minimalist drawings, but they're quite complex. And even though the guidebook is tiny, I think it's quite good. And it does tell you what is in you know, like what the plant is within the book. So this one may not necessarily help with, or may not necessarily help with plant identification, but it might help you with plant symbolism or thinking about those particular kinds of plants and so forth. And again, this is just one I pulled off the shelf as an example, but if you are interested, maybe you never took, I never took plant biology. I took a lot of other biology classes, but I never took a plant biology class. This might be, for me, a fun way to find, you know, a plant biology text. And while the deck is not necessarily going to get into all of those elements, I might see how they overlap. So this is the Tarot Botanicals deck. This one, Midnight Magic. This one, and again, there's other decks like this. I think this is kind of one of those newer kind of classics. I did edge this one. This one is by Sarah Richard. Oh, I guess I should have said. This is Tarot Botanical Tarot Deck by Earth Tricks. This is an indie deck. Any of the indie, I guess I just have one indie deck, or two. I will list all of the details for all of the decks, you know, creator, publisher, year published. If it's an indie deck or if it's out of print, I'll indicate that. And if it's not, then you'll be able to find it from the name and so forth. But this one is all mushrooms, and they're listed right on the, you know, right on the card. I'm guessing most of these are North American mushrooms, but again, you might be able to find, if you're not from, if you don't live in North America, and again, I'm not even positive in all of these, but this gives you the name of the mushroom and its Latin name and so forth. So this could be, in some ways, a bit like a field guide. You know, whether you're wanting to learn how to identify them or identify particular properties of them, and again, you know, or you're wanting to take a foraging class, I'm not saying that this is enough to get you to know which mushrooms are safe, but it still could be an added dimension into an interest that you're you know, that you want to pick up or want to further get into. You know, maybe you're gonna grow mushrooms, you know, for healing or for food, whatever it might be. This is just kind of an example of one of those kinds of decks that you might use as, again, sort of an entry point. And the guidebook is beautiful, and it does give you a tiny bit about each mushroom. You know, like for instance, the sun is the golden oyster mushroom, a wonderful warm weather mushroom that smells of watermelons and tastes like cashews. You know, so again, even if you're just wanting to learn a bit more about mushrooms themselves or foraging, it could be, again, sort of that entry point or that added dimension. And then Herb Crafters Tarot. I bought, actually it was a mystery box, it was in a subscription, but this was definitely a deck that had been on my list anyway. And this one reflects, or at least how it reflects in my practice, oh, by the way, so this is artwork by Joanna Powell Colbert and written by Letitia Guthrie. This is published by US Games, came out in 2019. I think this is one of those classics. And I feel like this is a wonderful entry point into learning more about herbalism or, you know, other forms of healing. And you can see here kind of what's going on in the pictures. And then the guidebook, while small, does give you you know, a little more to it. For instance, like 4 of water, which would be 4 of cups, is mint. And it talks about, you know, what's in the plant and why it might be used, or what's in the, you know, what's in the picture. Or here we've got marigold, and it even talks about crafting. And so again, it's an Herb Crafters Tarot deck. So whether you're coming to it from the standpoint of herbalism or something else, I identified a couple of years ago that I was interested in herbalism. I don't necessarily know that I'm going to do like a formal program, or if I'm just going to pick up bits and pieces here and there and do some of that in my own, you know, personal practice. You know, I definitely wouldn't put myself out there as an herbalist, but this felt to me like another way to learn more, in the same way that I'm picking up books and taking classes and so forth, all in that general kind of herbalism path, I guess. And so, you know, that whether I use this deck in terms of, you know, like, you know, doing readings about my herbalism, like what's the next path, you know, how should I approach it, or if I just want to learn and enjoy and, you know, notice the beauty in the art, and then, you know, while I'm reading other books and things, it's probably going to be a little bit of both. But those are just some examples. Anyway, I would love to hear what some of yours are. Was tarot the jumping off point? Did a deck make you interested in something, or did you get a deck because you were interested in that? Or where do those worlds for you unite? How does tarot give you other maybe entry points, or I keep using that phrase, but maybe it was a jumping off, or where you dive in to a new set of knowledge that maybe you wouldn't have had that not been for a particular tarot deck. I would love to hear. I know this is kind of a nebulous theme, but I just thought it would be fun to chat about. Anyway, I hope you're doing well. I hope you are taking care of yourself, hoping that you're finding ways to take care of others and the earth in a mutual aid way. And of course, I hope you're finding joy. And I hope to see you in the next video. Take care.